Buenos Aires, one of the great capitals of the world, was founded twice. The first time it failed so completely that the survivors are rumored to have eaten each other to stay alive. How does an empire lose a city and still end up conquering a continent? This is the story of how Spain colonized Argentina, not with an army of thousands, but with a handful of desperate, half-starved men, brutal ambition, and a search for silver that was for decades a complete and total failure. Before it had a name, before it had a flag, this land already had people. In the north, the Diaguita farmed terraced hillsides in the shadow of the Andes. In the northwest, the Quechua-speaking communities lived at the southern edge of the mighty Inca Empire. On the endless grasslands of the Pampas, nomadic hunters like the current followed the heads of guanaco across a horizon so flat it seemed to touch the sky. And in the south, the Tehuelche moved with the seasons through Patagonia's cold winds. None of them called themselves Argentine. That way didn't exist yet. It would come from a Spanish myth, a rumor of a mountain made of silver somewhere beyond the horizon. That rumor, that single glittering lie, is where our story begins. Because the Spanish didn't come to Argentina looking for land, they came looking for silver, and what they found instead very nearly killed every single one of them. In 1516, a Spanish navigator named Juan Diaz de Solis sailed into a vast mud estuary. So wide he first mistook it for open ocean. He named it Mar Dulce, the sweet sea, because its water was fresh, not salt. He went ashore to claim it for the Spanish crown. He never went back to his ship. Solsi was killed within minutes along with most of his men. Some accounts say the local Cherua people killed and ate them in front of the horrified sailors still aboard the ships. Through odds generated, the message traveling back to Spain was the same. This land does not want to be conquered. And yet they named it the River of Silver anyway. Not because they had found any. They hadn't found an ounce. They named it out of hope, out of a rumor of a white king somewhere upriver, sitting on a mountain of precious metal. That rumor would drag Spanish ships back to this river again and again for 25 more years. In 1536, a nobleman named Pedro de Mendoza arrived with the largest and best equipped expedition Spain had ever sent to South America. Over 1,000 men, soldiers, priests, horses, camels. He founded a settlement on the river bank. He called it Santa Maria del Buen Aire, Our Lady of the Good Air. Buenos Aires. It would not survive the year. Here is the problem nobody had planned for. This land had no silver, no gold, no Inca cities to plunder, just grass that stretched to every horizon, and the current people who were not interested in feeding over 1,000 uninvited strangers. At first, there was trade, then there were demands, then within weeks, there was war. The current, expert horsemen and warriors of the open plain laid siege to the Spanish fort. They burned the surrounding fields. They cut off their settlers from food. What followed is one of the darkest chapters in early colonial history. Trapped, besieged, and out of supplies, the colonialists began to starve. Historical chronicles, disputed by some historians but repeated for centuries, claim the disparate settlers resorted to eating the bodies of the dead, even the flesh of executed criminals, just to survive one more week. Ask yourself, what does it take to break an empire's confidence? For the Spanish, it was this: an army of 1,000 men, defeated not by cannon or sword, but by hunger, on a grassland with no name. By 1541, the survivors abandoned Buenos Aires completely and fled upriver. The first Spanish capital of Argentina didn't fall to indigenous conquests. It simply disappeared. But empires rarely give up. They regroup, they adapt, and Spain was about to try a very different strategy, coming not from the sea, but from the mountains. If the ocean route had failed, Spain would try the mountains. Following the same silver rumors, colonizers pushed south from Peru and east from Chile. Through some of the most punishing terrain on earth. Between 1553 and 1573, new cities rose in the northwest and center of Argentina: Santiago del Estero, Cordoba, Tucumán, San Juan, Mendoza. Unlike the Atlantic coast, this interior region has something the Spanish crown actually wanted: workable land, established indigenous farming communities, and proximity to the silver mines of Potos, the single richest silver deposit in the history of the world, just across the mountains in present-day Bolivia. Argentina's true colonial value wasn't buried under its own soil. It was its location. These new cities became supply stations, breeding mills, growing wheat, weaving textiles, all to feed the endless hunger of the Potos mines. And here is where the true cost of conquest becomes impossible to ignore. Spain governed through a system called the encomienda. Spanish colonialists were granted legal authority over indigenous communities, who were forced to labor and pay tribute in exchange for so-called protection and conversion to Christianity. In practice, it was forced labor with a religious excuse. Disease arrived alongside the soldiers: smallpox, measles, typhus, sicknesses these communities had never encountered and had no defense against. Entire villages were wiped out before a single battle was fought. Historians estimate that in the century following contact, indigenous populations across the Americas collapsed by as much as 90% in some regions. Not always through the sword, through something far quieter and far deadlier. In 1580, nearly 40 years after the first colon collapsed into starvation, a Spanish official named Juan de Guerrero returned to that same riverbank and founded Buenos Aires for a second time. This time it held, but for over a century, this second Buenos Aires remained a backwater, a smuggling port more than a capital, existing in the shadow of the interior cities and their silver roads. Everything changed in 1776. That year, Spain created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata and named Buenos Aires its capital. Overnight, the port city that had once been left for dead became the administrative heart of a territory stretching across present-day Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. 2.5 centuries after Saul's lost his life on that riverbank, the river that had killed him now carried Spanish silver, hides, and wealth back across the Atlantic every single year. The conquest that began as a myth about a mountain of silver had become real, not because the myth was true, but because Spain simply refused to stop trying. But conquest is never real finished. It only changes shape. And the tensions planted in these first centuries between settler and indigenous nation, between coast and interior, between wealth and want, would shape Argentina for the next 300 years, all the way to its independence and beyond.